Do you believe Nancy is alive? We don't know that.
It is over 67 days now, and nothing is still making sense in the Nancy Guthrie case. An elderly woman disappears from her own home. No signs of a struggle, no clear entry point, no confirmed suspect. And it's been like that. But now, two questions are starting to stare at us in the face. Not about what happened, but about what might have been missed. Because investigators are now looking at something very specific. The driveway, more specifically, whether tire tracks at the scene could have identified a vehicle. And at the same time, there's another question building in the background. Why hasn't the FBI released a profile? Because in cases like this, they usually do. And when they don't, you have to pay more attention. So now the case isn't just about what happened to Nancy. It's about whether something was overlooked, and whether investigators already know more than they're saying. So, what are we looking at? We're looking at possible tire evidence, how the scene was handled, and why the FBI is staying silent, because those three things might be more connected than they seem. We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything. So here's the part that people didn't really focus on at first. The driveway. When the aerial footage came out, most people were looking at the house itself, the doors, the layout. But if you look just a little lower, at the ground, you start to notice something else. There are tire marks, faint, but they're there. And when you follow them, one pattern stands out pretty clearly. It's consistent. It repeats in the same place. It looks like a car that belongs there, most likely Nancy's. But that's it. There isn't another set that clearly shows a second vehicle coming in or leaving. And that's where things start to feel off. Because if someone showed up and left with her, you'd expect at least some sign of that. Another set of tracks, something crossing over, something that doesn't belong. But you don't really see that. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't there, because the surface of that driveway is not a smooth pavement. It's decomposed granite, loose, uneven ground. And that kind of surface doesn't always hold tire detail well. Sometimes the marks are shallow. Sometimes they don't stand out unless you're looking at them the right way. Investigators can actually change how visible those tracks are just by adjusting the light. Lower angles, different directions, trying to catch the edges. And when you think about that, it opens up another possibility. Not that there were no other tracks, but that they were never clearly picked up. Or worse, they were there early on and didn't last. Because if vehicles moved through that driveway before anyone realized this was a crime scene, those marks wouldn't hold. They get broken up, mixed together, flattened out. And once that happens, you don't get them back. You're left with whatever survived. And right now, that looks like one clear pattern, and nothing else you can rely on. Which brings us to the real question. If someone drove in and left with her, why don't we clearly see it? This is where timing becomes a problem. Not later in the investigation, right at the beginning, because when officers first arrived, they didn't treat this thing like a crime scene. It was treated like something routine, something they've seen many times before. So movement wasn't restricted. People walked through the driveway, stepped across the ground, moved in and out without thinking twice. And under normal circumstances, that makes sense. But here's the issue. That early window matters more than anything that comes after. Because tire impressions, especially on a surface like this, don't last. They're fragile, and it doesn't take much to change them. One vehicle pulling in, another repositioning, even a few people walking across the same area, and suddenly, whatever was there starts to break apart. The edges blur, patterns overlap, details disappear. And once that happens, you can't separate it again. You can't tell what came first and what came later. You're left with whatever survived, and that might not be the full picture. So if another vehicle did come through that driveway, any trace of it had to survive those first moments, before anyone knew what they were dealing with, before the scene was locked down. And that's where the real issue is. Not just what we see now, but what might have been there in those first few hours and didn't last. Which brings us to the question everything hinges on. If evidence was there early, could it already be gone? Because at the moment it is looking like we are holding on to straws. So, let's say for a moment there were other tire tracks there early on. What would that actually do for investigators? Because this part is often misunderstood. Tire tracks don't give you a person. They don't tell you who did it. What they do is narrow things down. Every tire has a pattern, the tread design, the spacing, the way it's built. And those patterns aren't random. They come from specific manufacturers, specific models. The FBI actually has databases for this. Thousands of tire patterns cataloged and recorded. So if investigators capture a clean impression, they can compare it and figure out what kind of tire it is, not who owns it, but what it likely came from. That alone doesn't solve anything, but it gives you direction. Instead of looking at every possible vehicle, you're now looking within a smaller range. And that's where it becomes useful, because tire evidence works best when you already have something to compare it to. A vehicle seen nearby, a tip that comes in, someone who becomes a person of interest. Now you have something physical to check. You look at their tires and you compare. If it matches, that matters. If it doesn't, you move on. That's the real value. It doesn't point you to someone. It helps confirm or rule them out. But all of that depends on one thing. The original impression has to be clear, because if it's partial, distorted, or already disturbed, then you're not working with something solid anymore. You're working with guesswork. And investigators can't build a case on that. So this doesn't come down to whether tire tracks matter. They do. The real issue is whether they were ever captured in a way that makes them useful. Because if they weren't, then that entire line of evidence doesn't lead anywhere. And that pushes the case in a different direction. If tire tracks can't carry this, what else should investigators be relying on? When you look inside the house, one thing stands out. Not what's there, but how little had to happen. Because whatever took place inside that space didn't take long. There's no sign of a prolonged struggle, no indication that this turned into something chaotic. Instead, everything points in one direction. This was quick and controlled. Whoever was there didn't need time. They didn't move through the house creating disruption. They didn't leave behind a scene that explains itself. They came in, handled the situation, and left. And that changes how you look at everything else. Because now, this isn't just a missing piece of evidence. It's a question of capability. This kind of movement suggests someone who knew exactly what they needed to do and didn't hesitate. No wasted motion, no escalation, no loss of control. Just a short window where everything happened. And then it was over. Which creates a different kind of gap. Not just between inside and outside, but between expectation and reality. Because normally, something like this leaves a buildup, a sequence you can follow. But here, that sequence is compressed, reduced to a moment that doesn't fully show itself. And that's what makes the next step harder to track, because if everything inside happened that quickly, then whatever came next would have had to move just as fast. Which leads straight into the problem investigators are now facing. If it was that controlled inside, what did that look like when it moved outside? This kind of movement suggests someone who knew exactly what they needed to do and didn't hesitate. No wasted motion, no escalation, no loss of control. Just a short window where everything happened. And then it was over. Which creates a different kind of gap. Not just between inside and outside, but between expectation and reality. Because normally, something like this leaves a buildup, a sequence you can follow. But here, that sequence is compressed, reduced to a moment that doesn't fully show itself. And that's what makes the next step harder to track, because if everything inside happened that quickly, then whatever came next would have had to move just as fast. Which leads straight into the problem investigators are now facing. If it was that controlled inside, what did that look like when it moved outside?
Another thing we confirmed this week was through a source was that there were no, and the way it was described to me, there was no sign of an assault inside Nancy's house. It
Right.
was clean. Some rooms were described as immaculate to me. So if you're going in there when you would do your evidence job, I would just imagine, if there's a lamp that fell over, there's blood in a certain spot, you would know to focus on that area. But if a place is clean and there's no sign of an assault, like, where do you even begin?
So now there's a gap. Inside, everything points to something quick and controlled, but once you step outside, that clarity disappears because there's no clearly defined path showing how they left. There are a couple of key points around the back of the house, the gate and the door. Both have been discussed, both could have been used, but neither one tells a complete story on its own. There's no confirmed sequence, no clear direction of movement, just possible access points, without anything tying them together. And that's where things start to shift, because if the movement inside was as fast and controlled as it seems, then whatever happened next had to match that. There wouldn't be time for hesitation, no back and forth movement. It would be direct, in and out, one continuous motion, which raises another possibility. One that the movement didn't stay confined to one side of the house. It may have started at the back and continued toward the front, toward the driveway. Because if a vehicle was involved, that's where it would have to be. And if that transition happened quickly enough, you wouldn't expect a clear trail. Just small, incomplete traces, easy to miss, especially on ground that doesn't hold detail well. And that's what makes this part difficult to pin down. There's no clean handoff between inside and outside. No single point where you can say, this is where it all connects. Just two spaces and a missing link between them. Which leads to the question investigators are still trying to answer. If someone left with her, what did they actually leave behind? At this point, the focus shifts again. Not to what you can see, but to what should be there. Because if there was any kind of physical interaction inside that house, then something was left behind. Maybe not something obvious, but something small. DNA. Because in a situation like this, contact is almost unavoidable. Someone touches something, moves through the room, handles objects even briefly. And every one of those moments can leave trace material behind. Skin cells, saliva, things you wouldn't notice just walking through. That's why investigators don't just look at a scene. They break it down carefully, surface by surface. They swab areas where contact is likely, not just where something looks out of place, but where someone would have touched. And when that's not enough, they go further, using methods like luminol to reveal traces that aren't visible, even if someone tried to clean them. So the expectation here is pretty clear. If someone was inside that house, there should be something. But here's the problem. Nothing like that has been confirmed publicly. No clear forensic breakthrough. No single piece of evidence that's been pointed to and said, this changed the direction of the case, and that leaves things in a strange position. Because evidence can exist without being shared. Investigators may already have more than what's been made public, or they may still be looking for something that connects it all. And until that becomes clear, the case sits in between those two possibilities. Which brings us to the next question. If physical evidence is there, why hasn't it moved the case forward? At a certain point, the focus changes, not on the scene anymore, not on the evidence, but on the person who was there. Because when you look at everything together, one question keeps coming up. How was this done without leaving more behind? There are really only two possibilities. Either this person knew exactly what they were doing, or things just went their way. Right now, it's not clear which one it is, because the scene supports both. A controlled environment can point to someone who was prepared, someone who moved carefully, avoided unnecessary contact, and didn't make obvious mistakes. But it can also mean something else, that nothing went wrong, that whatever should have been left behind simply wasn't. And that uncertainty makes this harder to define, because without a clear mistake, there's nothing to follow. No single moment where everything breaks open. So instead of a clear picture of who this person is, you're left with a range. Someone who either planned this well, or someone who managed to get through it without leaving a trace. And those are two very different types of people, but from the outside, they look the same, which is why the case hasn't moved in a clear direction, because until that line becomes clearer, the person behind it stays undefined. And that leads to the next question. If it was done this cleanly, what kind of person does that point to? At this point, something else starts to stand out, not in the scene, but in what hasn't been shared. Because in cases like this, the FBI usually does something very specific. They build a profile, not of a known suspect, but of the kind of person they're looking for. How they behave, how they think, what patterns they tend to follow. It's not about naming someone, it's about narrowing the field. And in many cases, that profile is released, carefully, with limits, just enough to guide attention in the right direction. But here, that hasn't happened. There's no public profile, nothing that outlines the type of person investigators believe they're dealing with. And that's unusual, because this isn't something they overlook. It's something they decide, so when it's not released, there's usually a reason. Either they don't have enough to build one with confidence, or they do, and they're choosing not to share it.
What does your gut tell you now about the entry to the home? And was there forced entry? Or did she know the person that took her? What do you think now?
Okay, so I'm not going to get into the entry of the home or forced entry or any of that. What I'll tell you is I believe, just as I had initially, that Nancy was removed from that home against her will. She was kidnapped, and we still believe.
Because a profile doesn't just inform the public, it shapes the case. It changes what people look for, who they start to suspect. And in some situations, it can reveal more than investigators want out in the open. So the absence of a profile starts to feel like part of the strategy. Not a gap, but a choice. Which brings the focus back to the same tension we've been seeing throughout the case. Not just what's missing from the scene, but what's being held back from the public. And that leads to the question that doesn't go away. If they can build a profile, why haven't they shared it? At this point, the silence starts to feel different. Because investigators aren't working with nothing. They have information, witness interviews, people who saw things, or noticed something off. They have the scene itself, every detail documented and revisited, and they have forensic data. Samples collected, tested, and analyzed over time. All of that gets pulled together, compared, cross-checked, not just as separate pieces, but as a bigger picture. And from that, patterns start to form. Not always enough to name someone, but often enough to understand how this was done. And that brings us back to the profile. Because even if it hasn't been released publicly, there's a real possibility it already exists, internally, built from everything they've gathered so far. And if that's true, then what we're seeing from the outside is only part of the case, because investigations don't play out fully in public. Some details are held back on purpose, to protect the direction of the case, to avoid tipping someone off, to keep certain information controlled. So what looks like a lack of progress might not actually be that. It might be a case that's moving quietly, without showing its hand. And when you line that up with everything else, no clear suspect, no public profile, limited confirmed evidence, it changes how this case feels. Because now, the question isn't just about what's missing. It's about what isn't being shared, which leads to the question everything is building toward. Is the silence because they don't know, or because they do? When you lay everything side by side, a pattern starts to form, not from what's there, but from what isn't. The driveway doesn't clearly show a second vehicle, even though one may have been there. The early hours don't give a clean picture of what the scene looked like, because too much happened before it was treated as a crime. Inside the house, everything points to something quick and controlled, but not enough to explain how it all played out. And on the investigative side, there's still no public profile, no clear direction being shared, just limited information released carefully. So you're left with two sides of the same problem. On one side, evidence that may have existed briefly, but didn't hold. On the other, information that may exist now, but isn't being shown, and neither one fully connects. Because if a vehicle came through that driveway, it didn't leave something solid behind. If something happened inside that house, it didn't leave a clear sequence. And if investigators understand more today, they haven't revealed it. So the case sits in that space in between, not solved, not stalled, but not moving in a way the public can see. And that's what defines it right now. Not what's been confirmed, but what hasn't. Which leaves one final question. If the answers were there at the beginning, did the case lose them before anyone realized what they were looking at?